In 1913, a very poor child from Italy decided to escape the poverty he was living in and pursue the American dream aboard a ship. However, upon reaching America, he was met with a shocking reality. Americans had a strong dislike for Italian immigrants and immigrants in general. He found himself unable to find any work or know how to live there, leaving him with no choice but to turn to a life of crime. He eventually became one of the most dangerous mafia leaders, ultimately becoming the leader of all the leaders. But what exactly is his story, and what terrifying end awaits him? Continue with me. The story begins on November 21, 1897, in a place called Rio Nero, near the Italian city of Naples. On that day, a boy named Vito was born into a simple family, like most at the time, suffering from poverty. His father, Francesco Genovese, worked as a construction worker, while his mother, Nunziata, was a homemaker. Vito was one of 4 children in this very simple family. Details about their family life in Italy are scarce before they decided to emigrate to America due to the widespread Italian immigration to America during that period. People suffering from extremely harsh and difficult living conditions were leaving Italy in search of the American dream. Because of the political problems in Italy at the time, approximately 5 million people emigrated between 1876 and 1900s, and from 1900s to 1914, another 8 million people emigrated. Vito emigrated from Italy to America during the same period, specifically in 1913, when he was just 15 years old. Little was known about his personal life, but it was known that his education was basic due to the financial difficulties his family faced. He left school during his primary education and began working to help a little with the expenses. But when Vito arrived in America, he encountered difficulties and challenges in his life due to the American hatred towards immigrants, especially Italians who were arriving in large numbers. Naturally, finding work was very difficult, and he couldn't even afford enough food and drink. Many immigrants, especially Italians, turned to a life of crime and drug trafficking to survive. These Italians followed the same system as the Italian Mafia in their homeland, organizing gangs in the same style, Italian Mafia gangs existing in America. Among these individuals was a person named Vito, the protagonist of our story, who became one of the young men forming a criminal group or mafia gang called Cosa Nostra. But when we returned to Italy in the same year, 1913, before Vito emigrated, we find that his family was experiencing a great deal of despair, like most of their neighbors in the same Italian region. They all began making decisions to emigrate to America. But Vito's family, who made the same decision, did not emigrate all at once. Instead, Vito was the first to take the step, because his family relied on him to pave the way for them. He was, of course, a young, ambitious man, so he boarded the ship that would take him from Italy to America by sea. According to U.S. federal immigration records, his mother arrived 7 years later in America, specifically in 1920. However, the strange point in this matter is that there were no records of Vito's father in the Federal Immigration Archives, leaving them very puzzled about the father because they didn't know anything about him. Returning to Vito again, on his first day in America, he went to a relative of theirs in the Queens area and stayed with her until he began planning his life and figuring out exactly what he would do. However, he faced his first problem in America in 1917, when he was just 19 years old. Vito was arrested on charges of illegal firearm possession in Manhattan. When the lawyer started talking to him about the case he had fallen into, he began advising him and telling him it would be better for him to confess to this crime to receive a lighter sentence. But if he continued to deny it, the sentence would be harsher. Indeed, he confessed to having a weapon, and he was sentenced to only 60 days in prison. After that, World War I began, and Vito was offered the option to serve as a soldier in the war instead of serving his prison time. He agreed, and although he didn't participate in any battles, after this period, he transformed into a completely different person. In the years following his discharge from the army, signs began to appear that Vito was running a prostitution ring in America. As Italian mafia gangs spread throughout New York, Vito's star began to shine as a skilled smuggler in the period of 192. Sure, here's the continuation of the translation. 1924, during America's Prohibition era, when a legal ban was imposed on the trade of alcohol, the government completely stopped the alcohol trade because they feared that people were committing many crimes while drunk in the streets. Vito noticed that this would be the perfect opportunity for him to build his criminal empire. The officials who implemented the alcohol prohibition law believed that by doing so, they would close many businesses operated by immigrants who were involved in the alcohol trade. However, the opposite happened. The trade increased secretly, and secret bars began to appear, supplied by professional smugglers with large quantities of alcohol, with Vito being one of the most important suppliers. Despite Vito knowing well how to work in complete secrecy, away from the eyes of the police, in 1924, in mid-May, his name began to appear in government records after he was involved in a car accident. One of his companions in the car died due to the accident, while he suffered injuries and fractures. When the police arrived at the scene of the accident, they found a weapon near the car. Despite Vito's attempts to convince them that it was just a coincidence and a normal accident, the police were not convinced at all, especially after finding the weapon. They began to assume that the weapon belonged to a rival gang that was attacking Vito's gang. The police were able to make an accurate guess, suspecting that rivals in the alcohol trade attacked Vito, and this incident was the first government report made about him. After that, Vito's name frequently appeared in police reports, implicating him in murder cases and illegal possession of weapons. In July 1926, Vito suffered a serious neck injury from a gunshot, which nearly killed him, but he survived miraculously. During this period there was intense and deadly competition among Mafia gangs, most of whom were of Italian origin in America. Of course, Vito was one of the Mafia gang members competing, and these individuals I mentioned earlier were in their late 20s or early 30s at the time. They had the largest share of the illegal drug and alcohol trade away from the eyes of the police, under the leadership of Joe Masseria, who was considered the big boss of the Mafia at the time. The trio, Vito, Luciano, and Costello, succeeded in forming very important and good relationships after succeeding in smuggling and alcohol trade, and the child Vito became one of the wealthy in America after the extreme poverty he lived in with his family in Italy. As for the child Vito, he was not heavily reliant on the alcohol trade and smuggling. He also had another business, which was forging gold certificates, similar to bank certificates that people buy to preserve their money. Of course, this was much more dangerous than alcohol trade for the government, which is why the FBI started focusing heavily on the matter, because Vito was now turning into a major threat and danger. In 1930, Vito was arrested on many charges, but he was released because there was not enough evidence to convict him. Despite prison being a threat to Vito at that time, it was much safer than the dangers he faced outside, including the incident where a rival gang tried to attack him in the alcohol trade. And even when he was shot and the bullet hit his neck, he miraculously survived. This entire period was considered very bloody for Vito. In the same year, in February, the federal police began preparing to arrest Vito again, but at the same time, he was dealing with another conflict because he was now involved in the murder of one of his friends named Reina. Both Reina and Vito were working with the big boss at the time, Masseria, but Reina left them to work with a rival Mafia leader in Brooklyn, named Salvatore. Reina was shot dead when he was leaving his lover's house, and at the time the rumor was that Vito was among those who killed Reina. With Reina's murder, a street war began between Mafia gangs, known as the Castellammarese War, between Masseria's gang, which included Vito, Luciano, and Costello, and the rival gang that included Reina. The war had intense and violent confrontations, not only in America, but also in other streets outside New York. It reached a point where anyone associated with the matter was targeted. By late 1930, the battle began to take a side, turning against Masseria's gang, which included Vito. They were almost on the verge of defeat, and anyone found on the street would be eliminated. Vito and Luciano decided to reach out to the rival gang leader, offering him a deal that they would betray their boss in exchange for ending the battle and joining forces to share control over New York's mafia and alcohol trade. The deal was accepted, and on April 15th, here is the continuation of the translation. 1931, the infamous assassination of Joe Masseria took place while he was sitting inside a restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro. Vito was among the few people seated around the boss inside the restaurant. They executed the assassination with cold blood and ease, dealing with him as if he were a mere chicken. This is exactly what happened. Vito and a few others around the table opened fire with machine guns, ending the boss's life. With this straightforward assassination, the street war between the mafia gangs came to an end. However, a new problem quickly arose. The rival gang leader organized a meeting in New York, bringing together many mafia leaders. During the meeting, he declared that the Italian mafia in America would now be under the leadership of 5 major mafia bosses, referring to himself, Luciano, and 3 others. He also announced that every gang would have to pay him regularly as a fee for organizing the mafia's affairs. This led to discontent among the mafia members, as they wondered why he was treating them this way and making such demands. The trio, Vito, Luciano, and Costello, weren't comfortable with the situation, and were certain that the leader might be planning to eliminate them in his office in Manhattan. Their suspicions led them to decide to strike first before being struck. They enlisted the help of Meyer Lansky, an insider in the leader's building, who managed to let assassins sent by the trio into the building. They successfully executed the assassination, attacking the leader with gunfire and knives, ending his life instantly. This marked the end of the street war among the mafia gangs. However, this was, unfortunately, the beginning of new conflicts. After the successful assassination, Luciano held a meeting in Chicago, gathering mafia family leaders. He informed them that the mafia system would remain unchanged, but instead of being led by 5 families, there would now be 7. Luciano refused to become the sole leader of the mafia, aware that doing so would make him the next target for assassination. After the end of the First War, Luciano took over the family of the assassinated mafia leader, becoming the big boss. Vito became his right-hand man. Due to the high level he reached, Vito began to personalize the relationship between himself and Costello, considering him merely an advisor while he was higher and the right-hand man of the big boss. This caused tension and jealousy because in the first war with the boss they assassinated, they were on the same level. Unfortunately, a disaster struck Vito just a week after the meeting they held, specifically on September 17, 1931. His wife Donata died of tuberculosis, leaving behind a daughter named Nancy. Vito was deeply saddened and organized a large funeral ceremony for her, costing about $3,000 at the time. Shortly after, he became interested in another woman named Anna. The problem was that Anna was married to a small-time thief named Gerardo, who aspired to become a professional alcohol smuggler like Vito. Anna, in particular, captivated Vito, who was determined to win her over in any way possible. As a well-connected and influential mafia leader, Vito arranged for Gerardo's assassination on a Manhattan rooftop. The assassination was carried out in mid-March 1932, allowing Vito to marry Anna quickly. There was no strong evidence linking Vito to the assassination, because both Gerardo and his friend were found dead on the rooftop. Moreover, at the time of Gerardo's death, he held divorce papers from Anna, indicating that he was already separated from Anna, leaving the path open for Vito to marry her. However, Vito neither confirmed nor denied any involvement in the crime. After the assassination, Vito and Anna married swiftly, and 2 months later she gave birth to a son, meaning she had been involved with Vito while still married to Gerardo. Vito had been her secret lover. The small family, consisting of Anna, Vito, and their 3 children, Vito's daughter Nancy, the newborn Philip, and Anna's daughter from her first marriage to Gerardo, was about to undergo significant changes. Despite all these events, there was one crucial incident. The U.S. government decided to repeal the alcohol prohibition law, which had been the primary source of income for Vito's gang. In December 1933, the prohibition on alcohol was lifted, making it available to everyone who wanted to buy it, and smuggling was no longer profitable. Consequently, mafia gangs began searching for other fields to gain power, influence, and money. Vito's gang managed to dominate the drug trade in New York, primarily sourcing drugs from China. As things developed further, collaboration emerged between Italian and French criminals outside America managing drug factories in Marseille, France, and shipping them to Vito in America. However, Vito didn't settle for just one source of income or illegal activity. After securing his dominance in the drug market in New York, he ventured into another field with his partner, Siegel. Together they focused on gambling, expanding their influence and power in casinos and other gambling establishments. Siegel, Vito's friend, was responsible for finding locations for gambling operations where they could extend their reach. In 1934, Vito and another associate, Michael Miranda, decided to embark on one of their boldest adventures in the gambling industry. They set up a wealthy man in a gambling scam. The man, a rich individual who was losing heavily in gambling and lacked the necessary skills to win, was convinced to buy a fake money printing machine. Vito and Miranda sold him the machine for $160,000, claiming it would produce counterfeit money to reduce his gambling losses. The device was, of course, a hoax. Realizing he'd been swindled, the wealthy man chose to accept his loss rather than confront a mafia boss and risk his life. The problem arose with Ferdinand, who had provided Vito with information about the wealthy target. Ferdinand demanded $35,000, his share of the scam, believing he deserved it. For Vito, paying such a large amount was out of the question. Consequently, he ordered Ferdinand's assassination, along with his partner William, who had also contributed information for the scam. The assassination was carried out successfully in a Brooklyn cafe. However, Vito received shocking news. William had not been successfully killed because the individuals Vito sent to complete the task failed to carry out his orders to burn William alive. Miraculously, William survived and began causing trouble for Vito by providing a full account of everything that happened to the authorities, including his friend Ferdinand's murder. He implicated Vito as the mastermind behind the assassination. This led to a series of investigations and a case that haunted Vito for years. Vito was known for his violent nature, preferring to use force if necessary. When faced with the choice of paying $35,000, he opted to eliminate the threat altogether. His attempt to kill William by burning him alive was just another example of his ruthless character, willing to eliminate even the slightest potential threat. Despite being involved in numerous crimes, many for trivial reasons, Vito's violent and aggressive nature often led to decisions that alienated him from his partners and allies in America. This had a significant impact on the mafia world in America. As police pressure on Vito eased due to insufficient evidence in Ferdinand's case, another problem arose in 1936. A large police operation targeted around 200 brothels in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and it became clear that Luciano was responsible for the entire prostitution trade. After arresting many individuals from these houses, some began to confess and provide details, leading to Luciano's arrest on charges of pimping and running brothels. The trial was swift, resulting in a sentence of 30 to 50 years in prison. Despite numerous reports suggesting the charges against Luciano were fabricated, once he entered prison, he lost control of his mafia family. Vito, his right-hand man, took over as the new leader of the gang. Vito had no intention of allowing Luciano to return to his criminal family. As Luciano was transferred from one prison to another, he gradually lost his grip on his criminal empire, with Vito now in charge. Meanwhile, Thomas Dewey, the government official responsible for New York City, was determined to rid the city of all mafia gangs. As a major figure in the New York Mafia, Vito became the next target. He needed to quickly escape to New Jersey and establish it as a new base for his gang or mafia family, of which he was now the leader. Dewey kept a close watch on him for months, until finally announcing Vito's name in all newspapers as one of the Mafia leaders in New York City, spreading the news about him everywhere. Faced with this, Vito decided to abandon everything, taking his wife and children and fleeing as quickly as possible to avoid imprisonment, and living the rest of his life behind bars like Luciano. He managed to escape with his family to Italy, carrying a suitcase with approximately $750,000. Reports indicate that he did not return to America for 8 years. Meanwhile, his wife Anna and their 3 children returned to America to manage Vito's business affairs. Anna handled the business, sending Vito regular profits of about $100,000 each time for many years. During this time, while Vito was in Italy, a war was raging between Mussolini's government and the Mafia leaders. However, it was a superficial war, as Vito knew well that Italy didn't want to eliminate the Mafia entirely. They just wanted to control them and take profits. Vito used this to his advantage, drawing closer to the government, allowing him to work freely in the black market and conduct his business as he pleased. Meanwhile, in the United States, authorities were intensifying their efforts to clean New York of Mafia influence. However, Vito's fortunes took a turn when World War II began, and the United States occupied parts of Italy. As an American fugitive, Vito found himself in a precarious situation. In an attempt to leverage his circumstances, Vito offered to act as an informant for the American forces, providing them with valuable information about the Italian underworld. He hoped this would earn him favor and allow for a safe return to the U.S. However, in America, one of the individuals involved in the assassination of Ferdinand was arrested and confessed, implicating Vito as the mastermind behind the crime. Simultaneously, in Italy, the authorities uncovered Vito's black market operations, recognizing him as a significant threat to the state. Consequently, both countries presented legal challenges for Vito. He was under investigation in the U.S. for murder and in Italy for illegal trade activities. Eventually, American forces in Italy tracked down Vito and extradited him back to the United States after 8 years. Upon his return, Vito faced trial, but the case took an unexpected turn when the primary witness against him was found dead, leaving the prosecution without sufficient evidence to convict him. As a result, Vito was acquitted and released. Shortly after his release, Vito learned about a Mafia summit organized in Cuba by Luciano, who had been released from prison after assisting the U.S. during World War II. The meeting was intended to discuss future operations and re-establish Luciano's influence in the Mafia world. Vito attended the summit, reconnecting with old associates and strategizing the Mafia's future. In the years that followed, tensions brewed between Vito and Costello, both vying for leadership of Luciano's Mafia family. With Luciano's influence waning, the rivalry between Vito and Costello intensified, leading to a series of plots and counterplots. Eventually, Vito decided to eliminate his rival. He enlisted Vincent Gigante, a former professional boxer turned gangster, to assassinate Costello. On May 2, 1957, Gigante ambushed Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. Although the bullet merely grazed Costello's head, the attempt on his life was enough to convince him to retreat from Mafia affairs. Costello realized that his options were either death or imprisonment, like Luciano, and chose to step back, leaving Vito to take control. With Costello out of the picture, Vito achieved his long-desired position as the head of Luciano's Mafia family, and, effectively, the most powerful Mafia boss in New York. Over the years, Vito maintained his grip on power, but his reign was not without challenges. On July 7, 1958, Vito was arrested again, this time on drug trafficking charges. He was caught in a major drug deal involving Puerto Rican narcotics dealer Nelson Cantelops, who testified against Vito. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with substantial evidence presented, including eyewitness testimony and audio recordings. Despite his reputation and connections, Vito was ultimately convicted in 1959 and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Vito's lawyers attempted to appeal the conviction, but their efforts were unsuccessful. On February 11, 1960, Vito began serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Georgia. Despite his incarceration, Vito tried to manage his criminal enterprises from behind bars, but his influence waned as he was moved to different facilities, eventually ending up in a maximum security prison in Texas. Over time, Vito's health deteriorated significantly. He suffered from lung and heart diseases, bladder cancer, and other ailments. A 1967 prison report described him as appearing much older than his actual age of 70, struggling to maintain even basic physical activities. Recognizing his declining health, the prison authorities transferred him to a medical center for inmates in Missouri. By February 14, 1969, Vito's health had deteriorated beyond recovery. He passed away in the early hours of the day, marking the end of an era for one of the most notorious Mafia leaders. Contrary to expectations, his funeral was a modest affair, attended by only about 100 people, including friends of his daughter Nancy from school, underscoring his fall from power and relevance. Throughout his life, Vito had relentlessly pursued wealth and power, only to spend his final years attempting to escape the consequences of his choices. His story serves as a stark reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the inevitable downfall that follows a life of crime.